February 1943, Guadalcanal, Solomon Islands. The metal stretcher rattled against the deck of the landing craft as it pushed through the surf toward the beach. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto lay motionless, his uniform stained dark with blood and seawater, his eyes fixed on the canvas canopy above him. The morphine administered by the American corpsman had dulled the pain in his shattered leg, but it had done nothing to ease the terror that gripped his chest like a vice. Around him, American voices spoke in urgent, incomprehensible syllables. The smell of diesel fuel mixed with the metallic tang of blood. He closed his eyes and began reciting the final prayers his mother had taught him as a child in Osaka. He was 22 years old, and he believed he had minutes to live. For 3 weeks, Yamamoto had hidden in the dense jungle interior of Guadalcanal, surviving on roots and muddy water after his unit had been overrun during the American offensive. His leg wound had festered in the tropical heat, turning gangrenous, and delirium had set in. When the American patrol found him collapsed near a creek bed, he had been too weak to reach for the grenade he had saved for this exact moment, the final act of honor that would spare him the shame of capture. The Emperor's soldiers did not surrender. The Imperial Japanese Army's field service code, the Senjin-kun, was explicit. Do not live to experience shame as a prisoner. Die to ensure you do not leave behind a name soiled by disgrace. Yamamoto had memorized these words during basic training. Every Japanese soldier had. Surrender meant eternal dishonor. Not just for the soldier, but for his family, his village, his ancestors, stretching back through generations. It meant torture, execution, and a death without dignity at the hands of barbarians who knew nothing of the warrior's code. But Yamamoto had been too weak to pull the pin. The Americans had lifted him onto the stretcher with careful hands, and one of them, a medic with kind eyes, had immediately begun treating his wound. This confused him more than anything else. This was not how enemies behaved. This was not what he had been told would happen. The landing craft's ramp dropped with a metallic clang, and Yamamoto felt himself being carried up the beach. The sun was brutal overhead, and through his half-closed eyes, he caught glimpses of organized chaos. Rows of tents bearing red crosses, supply trucks rumbling past, stacks of crates and equipment stretching in every direction. American soldiers moved with purpose but without the frantic urgency of men under fire. Some of them glanced at the stretcher as it passed, their expressions neither cruel nor vengeful, merely businesslike, as if transporting wounded enemy soldiers was simply another task on a long list. Yamamoto tried to reconcile this with everything he had been taught about the Americans. They were supposed to be savage, undisciplined, corrupted by materialism and individualism. They were supposed to lack the spiritual strength and martial discipline of the Japanese warrior. They were supposed to be demons. The stretcher entered the shade of a large tent, and Yamamoto felt himself being transferred onto a cot with remarkable gentleness. A surgeon in blood-stained fatigues examined his leg, speaking to a nurse in that strange, rapid English. Yamamoto understood none of the words, but he understood the efficiency, the cleanliness of the instruments laid out on metal trays, the focused professionalism in the surgeon's movements. Then came the needle, another injection, and the world began to fade at the edges. His last conscious thought before the anesthesia took him was a question that violated everything he had been taught to believe. Why were they saving his life? This question, this fundamental confusion, would be asked by thousands of Japanese prisoners of war across the Pacific Theater between 1942 and 1945. Their collective experience would challenge the very foundation of their understanding of warfare honor and the nature of their enemy. What they expected was execution. What they received instead was medical care, hot meals, and treatment that adhered to international law. The psychological impact of this gap between expectation and reality would prove as significant as any battlefield victory, revealing a profound ideological chasm between the Japanese military's worldview and the American approach to warfare. The Imperial Japanese military's treatment of prisoners of war had set a standard of brutality that shocked even the hardened veterans of the European theater. When Japan signed the Geneva Convention in 1929, the military leadership had refused to ratify it, arguing that surrender was fundamentally incompatible with Japanese military tradition. The Bushido Code, the way of the warrior, emphasized death before dishonor, and the concept of becoming a prisoner was so shameful that it was barely acknowledged as a possibility in Japanese military planning. This wasn't merely philosophical rhetoric. It was codified policy with real consequences. Japanese soldiers were issued handbooks that explicitly stated prisoners had forfeited all rights and honor. Surrender was described not as a military necessity but as a moral failure equivalent to treason. This ideology had devastating consequences for Allied prisoners. The Bataan Death March in April 1942 had resulted in the deaths of thousands of American and Filipino soldiers through deliberate starvation, beatings, and executions. At Camp O'Donnell and Cabanatuan, American POWs died at rates exceeding 30% from disease, malnutrition, and systematic abuse. Japanese guards, operating under the belief that surrendered soldiers had lost their humanity, treated prisoners with contempt that ranged from casual cruelty to organized sadism. Red Cross parcels were confiscated or destroyed. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Food rations were deliberately kept below subsistence levels. Work details killed men through exhaustion. The message was clear. You surrendered, therefore you deserved suffering. When news of these atrocities reached American forces in the Pacific, many soldiers swore they would never take prisoners. The rage was understandable, even justified. But American military leadership, from MacArthur's headquarters down to division commanders, enforced a different policy, one rooted not in reciprocity, but in principle. The United States had ratified the Geneva Convention. American forces would comply with international law regardless of enemy behavior. This was not merely idealism. It was strategic calculation combined with fundamental belief in the rule of law. Military intelligence recognized that Japanese prisoners, if treated humanely, could provide invaluable information about enemy positions, strength, tactics, and morale. But beyond pragmatism was something deeper. The conviction that how America treated its enemies said something essential about what America was fighting for. This created an extraordinary paradox on the battlefield. Japanese soldiers who expected torture and execution instead found themselves in field hospitals receiving the same medical care as American wounded. They expected starvation and found themselves eating rations that exceeded what many had eaten in civilian life. They expected brutality and found themselves guarded by soldiers who followed regulations, who processed them through formal procedures, who treated them as human beings covered by international law. The psychological shock of this treatment cannot be overstated. For men who had been taught that surrender meant the end of their existence as human beings, the American response was profoundly disorienting. Private Yamamoto woke in stages, his consciousness returning like tide-filling tidal pools. The first thing he noticed was the absence of pain, or rather the transformation of the searing agony in his leg into a dull, manageable ache. The second thing he noticed was the smell, not the rot and jungle decay he had lived with for weeks, but something antiseptic and clean, mixed with an aroma that made his stomach contract with hunger. Food cooking. Real food. The third thing he noticed was the sound of rain drumming on canvas, and beneath that, American voices speaking in normal, unhurried tones. No one was shouting. No one was screaming. He opened his eyes fully and found himself in a long tent lined with cots. The wounded lay in rows on either side, and with a shock that jolted him fully awake, Yamamoto realized that some of the wounded were Japanese. Not just one or two, but dozens. A Japanese soldier in the cot beside him had his chest wrapped in fresh bandages. Across the aisle, another prisoner's arm was in a proper plaster cast. An American nurse moved between the beds, checking temperatures, adjusting blankets, offering water. She approached Yamamoto with a cup and gestured for him to drink. The water was clean, cool, and tasted faintly of metal from the canteen it had been stored in. It was the best thing Yamamoto had ever tasted. Over the following days, as his fever broke and his wound began the slow process of healing, Yamamoto observed a system that functioned with remarkable consistency. 3 times daily, orderlies brought food on metal trays. The portions were generous: rice, canned meat, vegetables, occasionally fruit. The rice was white rice, polished and well cooked, better than what Yamamoto had eaten as a soldier in the Imperial Army, where rations had grown increasingly meager as Japan's supply lines stretched and snapped. The American military seemed to have an inexhaustible supply of everything: medicine, bandages, food, soap, even cigarettes, which were distributed to patients who wanted them. The abundance was staggering, almost obscene to men who had spent months or years operating on the edge of starvation. A pattern emerged in the recovery ward that American medical officers began to document with fascination. Japanese prisoners, once they recovered from their initial shock and fear, displayed a complex mixture of emotions that seemed to follow a predictable progression. First came the silent observation phase, where prisoners watched everything with wary, calculating eyes, waiting for the cruelty to begin. This typically lasted 3 to 5 days. Then came a period of tentative acceptance, where prisoners would comply with medical treatment but without engagement or communication. They would eat the food, take the medicine, submit to examinations, but their faces remained masks of careful neutrality. The third phase was the most psychologically revealing, confusion giving way to something that intelligence officers began to classify as ideological crisis. Prisoners would ask, through interpreters, why they were being treated this way. Why were Americans wasting valuable medicine on enemy soldiers? Why were they feeding prisoners the same rations their own troops received? The questions revealed a fundamental assumption that the Japanese military had drilled into every soldier. In war, mercy was weakness, compassion was foolishness, and treating enemies with humanity was a luxury that no serious military could afford. The American approach violated every precept they had been taught. Corporal Masao Ito, captured during the fighting on Saipan in 1944, later described his experience in a post-war interview. When I woke in the American hospital, my first thought was that they were healing me so they could torture me properly. When they brought food, I thought it was poisoned. When the doctor operated on my wounded shoulder, I thought he would deliberately cripple me. It took many days before I understood that they were simply following their rules. They had rules for everything, even for how to treat prisoners. This was difficult for us to understand. We had no such rules. The rules Ito referenced were real and extensively documented. The American military's approach to prisoners of war was codified in field manuals, enforced by military police, and monitored by the International Red Cross. Article 27 of the Geneva Convention specified that prisoners must receive medical care equivalent to that provided to the captor nation's own forces. Article 26 mandated that food rations must be sufficient in quantity, quality, and variety to keep prisoners in good health. These weren't suggestions. They were legal requirements that American commanders took seriously, even when it stretched already overburdened supply lines. Colonel Harold W. Blakely, who served as the chief medical officer for prisoner facilities in the Central Pacific, wrote in a 1944 report, "The treatment of enemy wounded and prisoners is not a humanitarian indulgence. It is a military obligation and a strategic asset. Every prisoner who receives proper care and fair treatment is a potential source of intelligence. More importantly, word of proper treatment spreads. It encourages surrender, which saves American lives by reducing the fanaticism of enemy resistance. But beyond strategy, we treat prisoners humanely because we are Americans. We fight to preserve a civilization that values human dignity, including the dignity of our enemies." This philosophy was tested daily in the field hospitals and prison compounds scattered across the Pacific. American medical personnel treated Japanese soldiers with shattered limbs, infected wounds, malaria, dysentery, and tropical diseases that would have been death sentences without intervention. Surgeons performed amputations, set broken bones, transfused blood, and prescribed medications with the same care they provided to American wounded. Survival rates for Japanese prisoners who reached American medical facilities were remarkably high, higher, in many cases, than the survival rates for wounded Japanese soldiers who remained in their own military hospitals, where medicine and supplies had become desperately scarce. The food became its own form of propaganda, though American authorities never quite recognized it as such. It wasn't the nutritional content that mattered most to the prisoners, though the calories and vitamins certainly mattered to bodies ravaged by months of inadequate rations. It was the abundance, the variety, the casual plenty that the Americans displayed. Every meal told a story about industrial capacity, supply chain mastery, and a home front that could feed an army on the other side of the world without apparent strain. Private Yamamoto never forgot the first hot meal he received after regaining consciousness. It arrived on a segmented metal tray, white rice in one compartment, a thick stew of beef and vegetables in another, canned peaches in syrup, a piece of white bread with butter, and a small bar of chocolate. He stared at the tray for several minutes, unable to reconcile its contents with his understanding of wartime reality. This was more food than a Japanese soldier received in 3 days. This was the kind of meal a family in Japan might enjoy at New Year's if they were fortunate. And the Americans were giving it to prisoners. The chocolate bar, especially, seemed to represent something almost decadent. Chocolate was a luxury item in Japan even before the war. Now, in 1943, it was a distant memory for most civilians. Yet here it was, included in a prisoner's meal as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. He ate slowly, his shrunken stomach unable to handle the richness all at once. The beef was tender, genuinely tender, not the gristly, scarce meat that occasionally appeared in Imperial Army rations. The peaches were sweet enough to make his teeth ache. The bread was soft and white, nothing like the hard rice biscuits Japanese soldiers carried. When he finished, an orderly came by and asked through an interpreter if he wanted more. Yamamoto nodded, still too shocked to speak much, and a second tray appeared within minutes. This abundance, this casual surplus, appeared to be standard procedure. In the prison compounds that the Americans established on islands like Oahu, Guam, and later in camps on the mainland United States, Japanese prisoners encountered an entire system built around this principle of sufficiency. Mess halls served 3 hot meals daily. The Japanese prisoners appointed their own cooks who prepared rice and Japanese-style dishes using American ingredients. The portions were calibrated to provide approximately 3,500 calories per day, the same ration scale used for American soldiers performing light duty. Prisoners gained weight. Men who had arrived gaunt, malnourished, their bodies wasted by dysentery and beriberi, slowly filled out. Their wounds healed. Their strength returned. Sergeant Kazuo Sakamaki, the first Japanese prisoner of war taken by American forces after his midget submarine ran aground during the Pearl Harbor attack, spent most of the war in camps on the U.S. mainland. He later wrote about the persistent cognitive dissonance of his imprisonment. Every day I expected conditions to worsen. Every day I waited for the food to decrease, for the treatment to become harsh, for the reality I had been promised to finally emerge. It never did. We were fed better than Japanese civilians. We had medical care that most Japanese soldiers could only dream of. We had recreation time, sports equipment, even theatrical performances. I began to understand that I had been lied to about many things. The lie Sakamaki referenced was comprehensive and systematic. The Japanese military and government had constructed an elaborate narrative about American weakness, moral corruption, and inability to sustain a long war. Americans, Japanese soldiers were told, were soft, individualistic, obsessed with comfort, and unwilling to make sacrifices. Their democracy was portrayed as chaotic and inefficient, their diversity as weakness, their emphasis on individual rights as a fatal strategic flaw. The Bushido spirit, Japanese soldiers were assured, would triumph over American materialism. Spiritual strength would overcome industrial capacity. But in the prison camps, Japanese prisoners confronted evidence that challenged every element of this narrative. The Americans weren't weak. They were organized with a precision that matched or exceeded Japanese military efficiency. Their democracy wasn't chaotic. It produced a war machine of staggering power. Their materialism wasn't a weakness. It was a strength that manifested in full warehouses, functioning supply chains, and the ability to feed millions of soldiers across 2 oceans. Most disturbing of all, American guards and administrators consistently treated prisoners with a dignity that the Imperial Japanese Army never showed to its own rank-and-file soldiers, much less to prisoners. The psychological transformation that many Japanese prisoners underwent was documented extensively by American intelligence officers, who recognized that they were witnessing something historically significant. Interrogation reports from 1943 onward show a pattern. Initial interrogations yielded little. Prisoners would give only name, rank, and serial number as military protocol required. They expected torture, and many seemed almost disappointed when it didn't come. But after weeks in captivity, after medical care and regular meals, after being treated with consistent rule-bound fairness, many prisoners began to talk. Not under duress, but seemingly from a need to reconcile their expectations with reality. Lieutenant Tadashi Teramoto, a fighter pilot shot down over the Philippines in 1944, described his transformation in a post-war memoir. I had been taught that Americans were devils, that they would violate the honor of prisoners, that death was preferable to capture. When I parachuted from my burning plane, I carried a pistol with one bullet. The last one was for me. I intended to use it, but when American soldiers reached me, they disarmed me gently. They bandaged my burns. They gave me water. At the field hospital, a doctor, an American doctor, spent 3 hours treating my injuries. He spoke to me kindly, through an interpreter, telling me that I would heal, that I would survive. Why would he do this? I had been trying to kill Americans just hours before. By the logic I had been taught, I deserved nothing but contempt, but I received compassion instead. This broke something in my understanding of the world. What broke in Teramoto and thousands like him was the ideological framework that had sustained Japanese military culture. The framework insisted that the emperor's soldiers were special, spiritually superior, inheritors of a warrior tradition that elevated them above other armies. It insisted that sacrifice, even suicidal sacrifice, was the highest virtue. It insisted that the enemy was fundamentally inferior, lacking in the moral and spiritual qualities necessary for true warriorhood. But when that inferior enemy treated prisoners with systematic humanity, when they displayed organizational competence that exceeded Japanese military efficiency, when they demonstrated material abundance that revealed Japan's desperate poverty, the framework cracked. American intelligence officers began developing techniques specifically designed to exploit this ideological crisis. They weren't torture techniques. They were conversation techniques. Officers trained in Japanese language and culture would sit with prisoners and simply talk. They would ask about the prisoner's home prefecture, his family, his life before the war. They would share cigarettes, American cigarettes always in plentiful supply. They would discuss Japanese literature, history, culture, treating the prisoners as educated human beings rather than defeated enemies. Then gradually they would introduce questions about military matters, unit strength, morale, supply situations, and many prisoners, psychologically unmoored by the gap between what they had expected and what they experienced, would answer. This wasn't universal. Many prisoners remained loyal to the emperor and refused to cooperate beyond the minimum required by circumstance. The ideology ran deep, especially among officers and veteran soldiers. But the percentage of prisoners who proved willing to provide intelligence increased dramatically as the war progressed. By 1945, American forces had access to detailed information about Japanese defensive positions, troop movements, and even strategic planning, much of it derived from prisoner interrogations. The Japanese military command never quite grasped how thoroughly their ideology of death before dishonor had contributed to this intelligence failure. They had created a system where surrender was unthinkable, which meant they had no doctrine for training soldiers to resist interrogation if captured. The assumption was that capture simply wouldn't happen. When it did happen in increasing numbers, the psychological impact left many prisoners vulnerable to questioning that treated them as human beings rather than dishonored corpses. In the medical wards and prison camps, a symbol emerged that prisoners later described with almost religious significance: the white rice bowl. It appeared 3 times daily, filled with properly cooked rice, often supplemented with fish, vegetables, or meat. For Japanese prisoners, rice was more than food. It was cultural identity, comfort, home. The Imperial Japanese Army's deteriorating supply situation had reduced rice rations to meager portions of inferior grain mixed with barley or millet. Many soldiers went days without rice, subsisting on whatever foraged or captured food they could find. Some units were starving. Then came capture, and with it white rice, clean, well-cooked, served in quantities that allowed men to eat until their hunger was satisfied. The Americans, with their logistical mastery, had ensured that even their prisoners ate rice, not because regulation required it, but because military dietitians understood that morale and cooperation improved when prisoners received culturally appropriate food. The symbolism was almost too perfect. Japan, which styled itself as an empire destined to lead Asia, could not feed its own soldiers. America, the foreign devil, provided Japanese prisoners with better food than they had eaten in the emperor's service. Corporal Yamamoto, his leg healing slowly under the care of American surgeons, found himself fixating on the rice bowl. It appeared on his tray 3 times daily. a constant reminder of the contradiction between his reality and everything he had been taught. He began to watch the American medical staff with new attention. They worked long shifts, sometimes 18 or 20 hours when casualties were heavy. They moved between Japanese prisoners and American wounded without visible distinction in care or effort. The nurses checked his temperature and changed his bandages with the same professionalism they showed to American patients. The doctors consulted over his case, discussing treatment options, deciding to save his leg rather than amputate despite the extensive damage. This care extended beyond the medical ward. When Yamamoto was transferred to a recovery compound, he found a facility that functioned with remarkable efficiency. Prisoners were housed in barracks with real beds, not the ground or rough platforms he had slept on as a Japanese soldier. Latrines were clean and maintained. Showers provided fresh water. A small library held Japanese books, not propaganda, but actual literature, poetry, classics. There were sports facilities where prisoners could play baseball, a game many had known in Japan. The Americans had even provided equipment for traditional Japanese games. The administration of the camp followed visible rules. Guards did not randomly assault prisoners. Punishments, when they occurred, were proportional and documented. Prisoners could file complaints, and those complaints were investigated. This rule-bound approach was alien to men who had experienced the Imperial Japanese Army system, where officers routinely struck enlisted men, where arbitrary punishment was expected, where brutality was simply how military discipline functioned. The American insistence on following written regulations, on treating prisoners according to codified standards, represented a different philosophy of authority, one based on law rather than personal power. As the war ground toward its conclusion, the population of Japanese prisoners grew from a trickle to a flood. The fall of Saipan in July 1944 produced the first mass surrenders, with thousands of Japanese soldiers and civilians taken into American custody. Iwo Jima and Okinawa added thousands more. By the war's end, approximately 41,000 Japanese prisoners were held in American custody, a tiny fraction of the millions of Japanese military personnel, but still a significant number given the intense cultural prohibition against surrender. These prisoners underwent a collective experience that would shape post-war Japanese society in unexpected ways. They had been removed from the ideological hothouse of wartime Japan and placed in an environment where American values were not described but demonstrated. They saw democracy in action, even in the mundane details of camp administration. They saw abundance that revealed the scale of American industrial power. They saw racial integration that contradicted Japanese propaganda about American race hatred, Black, white, and Hispanic American soldiers working together, eating together, following the same regulations. They saw women in positions of authority, serving as nurses, administrators, and even intelligence officers. They saw a military that functioned through institutional rules rather than personal charisma. Some prisoners responded to this experience with deeper resentment, convinced that American material wealth was somehow illegitimate, or that the proper Japanese spirit had simply been overwhelmed by numbers. But many others underwent genuine ideological transformation. They began to question what they had been told about the war, about the emperor, about Japan's destiny to lead Asia. Letters that prisoners were allowed to send home, carefully censored but still personal, began to hint at this transformation. "The Americans are not what we were told," one prisoner wrote to his brother. "They fight with rules. They have enough of everything. They do not seem to hate us, though we gave them reason to. I do not understand this. But I can no longer believe what we were taught." The American military's psychological warfare units recognized the propaganda value of well-treated prisoners and began dropping leaflets over Japanese positions showing photographs of prisoners eating, receiving medical care, and living in comfortable conditions. These leaflets included safe conduct passes and instructions for surrender. Japanese military authorities ordered soldiers to destroy these leaflets without reading them, but the order itself revealed the threat they posed. The idea that surrender might lead not to death but to food, medicine, and eventual return home was dangerous to military discipline that depended on the conviction that there was no alternative to victory or death. The effect was difficult to measure, but real. American forces in the Pacific noted that Japanese resistance, while still fierce, showed signs of evolving psychology as the war progressed. More soldiers raised white flags. More small units attempted to surrender rather than fighting to the last man. Intelligence officers reported that prisoners, when asked why they had surrendered, increasingly mentioned hearing from other soldiers about American treatment of POWs. The mythology of inevitable execution was eroding, slowly replaced by the reality that capture meant survival. On August 15, 1945, Emperor Hirohito announced Japan's surrender in a radio broadcast that most Japanese heard for the first time, the voice of the man they had been taught to revere as divine. The war was over. In prison camps across the Pacific and on the American mainland, Japanese prisoners received the news with complex emotions. Relief that the killing had stopped, shame that Japan had been defeated, confusion about what would happen to them now. Fear that surrender might mean the punishment they had escaped as individuals would now be applied collectively. Instead, the Americans began processing prisoners for repatriation. The same system that had fed and cared for them during captivity now worked to return them to Japan. Ships loaded with former prisoners sailed west across the Pacific, toward a homeland that most prisoners feared would reject them. The stigma of capture remained intense in Japanese society. Families of prisoners had sometimes been told their relatives were dead rather than admit they had surrendered. Some prisoners committed suicide rather than return home to certain dishonor, but many did return, and they brought with them a complicated legacy. They had seen American power firsthand, not as victims of brutality but as recipients of institutional care. They had experienced a system that, for all its flaws, operated according to principles of law and human dignity, that contrasted sharply with the Imperial Japanese military's approach. They had eaten American food, received American medicine, and been treated according to American standards of military justice. Some remained bitter, convinced that they had been victims of American propaganda. Others became advocates for Japan's post-war transformation, arguing that their captivity had shown them possibilities for a different kind of society. Former prisoner Tadashi Teramoto, the fighter pilot, returned to Japan and eventually became an educator. In a 1965 interview, he reflected on his wartime experience. "I spent 18 months as a prisoner of the Americans. In that time, I learned more about democracy than I could have learned in a lifetime in wartime Japan. Not from speeches or lectures. The Americans didn't try to indoctrinate us. I learned from watching how they organized themselves, how they followed rules that applied equally to everyone, how they had enough of everything because they had built systems that produced abundance. When I returned to Japan, I saw our country begin to adopt similar systems. Some call this Americanization. I call it learning from experience." Teramoto's perspective was not universal among former prisoners, but it was not rare either. Studies of former Japanese POWs conducted in the decades after the war showed that many harbored surprisingly positive views of their American captors. They remembered the medical care, the food, the adherence to rules, and the general absence of the cruelty they had expected. These memories existed alongside trauma, grief for fallen comrades, and complicated feelings about defeat. But the fundamental fact remained: they had expected execution and had received mercy instead. That experience, replicated across tens of thousands of prisoners, had revealed a truth that Japanese military propaganda had worked desperately to conceal. That the enemy was not monstrous, that American power was based on principles that produced results, and that the entire ideological framework of Japanese militarism had been built on lies. Private First Class Takeshi Yamamoto survived the war, his leg saved by American surgeons who could have simply let the gangrene spread. He returned to Osaka in late 1946, walking with a permanent limp but walking nonetheless. His family had believed him dead. His name had been struck from the community rolls, his presence erased from official records. His father, a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War who had instilled in Yamamoto the values of Bushido and duty, could barely look at him. The shame of survival through surrender was a weight that Yamamoto would carry for the rest of his life, but he carried something else too. A memory of white rice in a metal bowl, served 3 times daily without fail. A memory of a surgeon's careful hands and a nurse's professional kindness. A memory of guards who followed regulations instead of whims. A memory of abundance where he had expected scarcity, and humanity where he had expected brutality. These memories did not erase his shame or solve the complex psychological burden of being a returning prisoner in post-war Japan. But they remained stubborn and persistent, evidence of a reality that could not be entirely explained away by ideology or propaganda. In the decades after the war, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation and then as an ally, the story of Japanese POWs and their treatment by American forces became part of the complicated narrative of the Pacific War. It was not a story that either side particularly wanted to emphasize. Americans preferred to focus on Japanese atrocities against Allied prisoners, which were real and horrific. Japanese society preferred to simply forget about prisoners entirely, maintaining the fiction that all soldiers had fought to the death. But the story persisted in the memories of those who had lived it and in the documentary record that American military efficiency had created and preserved. What emerges from that record is not a simple tale of American virtue triumphing over Japanese cruelty, though there were certainly elements of both. What emerges instead is a story about the power of institutional values and the consequences of ideological rigidity. The American military treated Japanese prisoners humanely, not primarily because individual Americans were especially compassionate, though many were. They treated prisoners humanely because they had built institutions based on rules, law, and the principle that even enemies retained certain fundamental rights. These institutions functioned even when individual Americans were filled with rage at Japanese atrocities, even when battlefield conditions were chaotic, even when following the rules required effort and resources that could have been used elsewhere. The Imperial Japanese military, by contrast, had built a system that treated human life, including the lives of its own soldiers, as expendable fuel for the war machine. Their ideology celebrated death and scorned survival. Their treatment of prisoners reflected not individual Japanese cruelty, though there was certainly that, but a systematic devaluation of human dignity that poisoned their entire military culture. The consequences of this approach included not just the suffering they inflicted on Allied prisoners, but the psychological damage inflicted on their own soldiers, who were taught that their value existed only in death. When these two systems collided in the prison camps of the Pacific Theater, the results were predictable in retrospect, but shocking to those who experienced them. Japanese soldiers expected to be treated the way they had been taught to treat others. They expected the brutal logic of their own military culture to be universal. Instead, they encountered something different, a system that, for all its imperfections and contradictions, maintained that there were rules that applied even in war, that even enemies were covered by law, that abundance should be used to sustain life rather than hoarded while people starved, and that military strength came not from scorning death but from organizing society to value and preserve human potential. The white rice bowl, served 3 times daily to men who expected only execution, became more than a symbol. It became an argument, made not in words but in the language of consistent action, about what kind of society could sustain a long war and what kind of world was worth fighting for. The Japanese soldiers who filled those bowls and ate that rice found themselves confronting a question that their ideology had never prepared them to answer. If the enemy fights with honor, treats prisoners with humanity, and demonstrates strength through abundance rather than scarcity, then what does that say about the nature of the war itself? For some, this question led to transformation. For others, it led only to deeper confusion and pain. But for all of them, it revealed a truth that military propaganda could obscure, but not entirely destroy. That the way a nation treats those who are completely in its power, prisoners who can neither fight back nor escape, reveals something essential about that nation's character and the values it actually holds, as opposed to the values it merely claims. In the end, perhaps that is what the American treatment of Japanese prisoners demonstrated most powerfully. Not that Americans were better people, but that they had built better systems. Systems based on law rather than arbitrary power. Systems that valued abundance and efficiency rather than scarcity and sacrifice. Systems that saw human beings as resources to be developed rather than as expendable tools to be used until broken. These systems were far from perfect. They existed in a nation that still grappled with racism, inequality, and injustice. But in the specific context of the Pacific War, they proved more effective, more sustainable, and more humane than the alternative. The Japanese soldiers who survived American captivity carried this knowledge back to Japan, where it would shape in ways large and small the nation's post-war evolution. They had seen what a different kind of society could produce. They had eaten its food, received its medicine, and lived under its rules. They had expected death and received life instead. That experience, repeated across tens of thousands of prisoners, became part of the foundation on which post-war Japan would rebuild, not as a conquered people adopting alien values, but as a society relearning truths that its wartime ideology had forced it to forget. The white rice bowl remains. Not as a physical object, those metal trays were melted down and recycled long ago, but as a memory, a symbol, a reminder that even in the midst of total war, choices remain about how to treat those who are powerless. America made a choice, imperfect and incomplete but real, to treat its enemies as human beings covered by law. That choice saved lives, produced intelligence, and demonstrated through action rather than propaganda what America claimed to be fighting for. It was not the whole story of the Pacific War, but it was a true part of that story, and perhaps the part that, in the end, mattered most to the men who lived it and carried its lessons forward into peace.